All right, folks, welcome to another episode of Day in the Life of DFIR. This is a series that gives a glimpse into the careers in the digital forensics and incident response field. Today, we have a very exciting guest, the legendary Derrick Donnelly. You might have worked with him back when he was at Apple or when he founded BlackBag and more recently at Celebrite. He's been around the block and been a staple in the forensics community. Derrick, welcome to the show.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
And if we can start off with asking you how you got into the field of digital forensics.
It's a really sort of complicated story because it involves this long love affair with the Mac or with Apple products that started way back when I was in. So I grew up in Quebec City, Canada, and I was going to college, actually at the same college where my dad was an academic dean. And this was in Quebec, they called them CEGEP. So it was a French CEGEP. And they actually brought in Macs on a large scale. So basically all the teachers had Macs, like the very first Macs. Part of the reason why is that the software was actually really easy to translate at the time. So that's when I started using a Mac. I got my first Mac, went to university with my Mac Plus, my Mac Plus 512. My big deal at the time was getting an 80 meg hard drive, 80 megs, right? Not gigs, not terabytes, megs, right?
And you'll never use all that disk space,
right? Oh, I never use all that, right? And it was like, oh, I could store technically, it was something like, I don't know, I think 130 floppies, right? But so that was one of my first upgrades. I remember going to university with that and doing my papers and then doing papers for pretty much everyone else. That's when it kind of started with me using computers. And I was actually visiting a friend of mine in Ottawa, Canada, and I ended up getting a job with the Competition Bureau, which is part of Industry Canada. And it would be the equivalent of the Federal Trade Commission, but in Canada. And it was actually an all Mac network. That was one of the reasons why I was interested in this specific department of the federal government. I was brought in as a kind of an IT specialist on the Mac side. And about 6 months after I started, I went to, they basically said, you're becoming a federal law enforcement officer. And I did my basic training in Cornwall and then went straight to the Canadian Police College to learn how to do computer forensics. Now, the Competition Bureau has search and seizure powers, and they'd exercise them a lot. And they had people that could search paper, but they didn't know how to do computers. So that's when I went to the Canadian Police College and started to learn how to do computer forensics. Now, again, dating myself, this was early on, pretty much DOS tools. You might even be familiar with some of the tools from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that go way back.
Oh yeah, those are definitely the big tool set back in the day. The RCMP tools.
It was, the RCMP tools and the Gord Hama, who was the author of those tools. I knew him quite well and knew him through the Canadian Police College, and then worked a lot with him with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And then he kind of said to me, you should do something for the Mac. And I started working on some tools. And it was very much modeled after his utilities. And again, they were all DOS-based command line tools, nothing like the visual tools that we have today. Very much almost Unix command line, Linux command line, equivalents, and running this from a floppy, running the tool. So when I started coding this stuff for the Mac, very different. Immediately there was windows and buttons and things like that. And that's when I started writing some of the utilities after basically getting all my basic training and learning how to do digital forensics. So I did a lot of cases, obviously, for my agency, but then I was also tied into many cases with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, especially when they get Mac cases. I was assisting them a lot with different cases. And then at the Canadian Police College, they asked me to basically put on a full week of training for Macintosh forensics. So I developed one of the first curriculums in Canada at the Canadian Police College. And this was, again, through my own agency. I could assist with this a lot because we had Macs, we were a Mac network, we had the software and stuff like that. So I started teaching a lot at the Canadian Police College. And from there, I actually started working with a bunch of different agencies in the US, including the FBI and Department of Defense and some intelligence agencies, a couple Secret Service, a bunch of different agencies, met them through some of the different conferences like HTCI and things like that. And then started working with those agencies, either assisting them with cases or actually doing training. Did a lot of training and spent a lot of time on the road doing training in the US. And during all that time, it was an amazing time working on all this stuff and working on some great high profile cases, but also got to see how things were different in the US and other agencies and things like that. And from there, in kind of the midst of all that, my agency had decided they were going to get rid of all their Macs. And I made this announcement: when the last Mac is gone, I'm gone. I didn't quite know where I was going yet, but around that same time, I actually had an opportunity to go to Mac World. And this was in 1998. Went to Macworld in San Francisco and basically got recruited by Apple and headed up IT security for Apple for 5 years. So basically packed up my stuff from Ottawa. At the time, there was this huge freezing rainstorm in Canada. And I talked to my girlfriend, now my wife, and said, what do you think about moving to sunny California? So it was a pretty easy decision. She was actually a nurse and she worked at the Stanford University Hospital. And I worked at Apple for 5 years, which was an amazing time. 2 days after I started, I went to Dienza College to the amphitheater, and Steve Jobs introduced the first iMac to the world. So my timing was incredible. Great 5 years at Apple. And the software that I had actually started writing up in Canada, I'd actually declared it as my own intellectual property when I went into Apple. They said, your forensic stuff is very interesting. I don't think we'll ever use it. Well, I ended up doing quite a bit of forensics there. And then I really enjoyed forensics so much, I decided I wanted to do it full time. And left Apple and founded BlackBag Technologies with 2 other partners in 2003. And then from that point on, that early software became the Macintosh Forensic Suite and later became Blacklight. And from there, I had also developed a Macquisition and a whole series of tools, and we did a lot of training for law enforcement around the world. BlackBag. And again, this was in California, in San Jose, but spent a lot of time on the road doing training, developing software, working with lots of agencies. And in the midst of all that, about 2 years ago, just a little bit before the pandemic started, BlackBag was actually acquired by Cellbrite in Israel. So I was on for 2 years with Cellbrite, mostly doing research. And then I retired in March this year. Now I'm kind of working on different projects. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but it's kind of a complicated way of how I started specifically on the Mac and specifically ended up in digital forensics.
Excellent. Yeah, that actually was very helpful in knowing your background there. So it was kind of weird. So you went to this federal agency wanting, doing computer stuff, and then he just told you, oh, you're going to be a federal police officer. Here's your gun. Go go arrest people, or you have the arrest powers to arrest people and whatnot.
Well, interestingly enough, it's almost a little bit like a British Bobby. We didn't carry a gun. That's what was even interesting, right? So and remember that the Competition Bureau was basically enforcing economic law in Canada. So things
Mm,
like bid rigging, price fixing, monopolies, all that kind of economic type crime, or potentially, and there could be civil aspects, there can be criminal aspects, but basically, again, very similar to what the Federal Trade Commission would do.
mm,
But we did that in Canada. So most of our search warrants were either related to like bid rigging, price fixing, or something as simple as, or as complicated as, if you want to think about it, as like gas stations all having the same price. So you drive down the street and everyone has the same price. So why is that, right? Or, companies would get together and potentially, do bid rigging or things like that. So that's what we were basically enforcing, and we would execute search warrants all around Canada related to that. But I did my basic training, but after that, I was mostly spent most of my time doing computer forensics. We execute a search warrant, and I'd be in a most of the time just in a suit. And if there was a potential risk of violence, then we'd have the RCMP assist us with the search warrant. So again, very, as law enforcement, I was a federal law enforcement officer, but and it's always been a bit of a joke too. When I was in the U.S., I didn't carry a gun, so it was very similar to like Robin Williams talking about the British cops. It's like stop, or I'll say stop again, or I'll say it louder, right? But we did have obviously the authority to execute search warrants, and most of the time that information would go into an investigation, and it could potentially go either to the competition tribunal, or it could become a criminal case depending on what type of a case it involved.
So, do you have any interesting cases from back then that you can talk about?
Sure. There was actually this one interesting case. So when I first started doing some training at the Canadian Police College, and I would teach Macintosh forensics, I worked on this scenario that was interesting. That it was involving creating Canadian currency, and it was counterfeit currency, obviously, and it was using an old Mac 2CI connected back then to some of the first Canon laser photocopiers, and the 2CI would be connected directly to the Canon printer photocopier, and it could produce some really nice color pictures. And I developed this scenario around you had to do a forensic investigation and prove that this crime had occurred of counterfeiting. Well, after I developed that scenario, about a year later, I get a call from the RCMP, and it said, we just seized a bunch of Macs in some part of Canada. I forget where it was, and it was a it was a counterfeiting case involving a Canon laser photocopier, and I wasn't sure if I was being called in to assist or if I was being called in to be questioned. But so I went to the lab at the RCMP, and there in the evidence, a couple of Mac 2CIs and Canon laser photocopier, huge Canon laser photocopier. And the way this came about was it was actually the guys who are printing this currency had actually called in a service tech because something wasn't working on the printer, and the service tech saw currency printed that was sitting in the trash, and actually called law enforcement, and they got involved. But so that was actually one of the first criminal cases I sort of ever dealt with. This was with the RCMP, and basically it was so strange that my scenario was so similar. Even some of the artifacts I was looking for were like, oh my God, this is almost the same stuff in this scenario that I developed almost a year earlier for our training purposes. So it's one of those ones that's always sort of stuck in my mind. And you got to remember too that this was like really early on, when some of the tools like in-case and FTK and stuff like that, they didn't exist yet, right? So
Yeah.
some of these tools, how we did the imaging in the day, was there was basically not even write blockers at that point. So how you could potentially image something without changing data was really tricky on a Mac. And these Mac 2CIs, they actually had a SCSI drive. People forget what SCSI drives are. We had IDE drives, we had SATA drives. Well, SCSI drives was another interface, and that was in itself not an easy interface to deal with. And then potentially trying to image that drive, and it might be 100 megs, it might have been a gig, a couple of gigs, whatever it was, imaging it. But there was always some really interesting technology from the standpoint that once you got an image, you could actually treat basically a raw image, or what we would potentially call today a DD image, or potentially a Linux image or whatever. But there was actually always really interesting ways on the Mac how to basically treat it as a disk copy image. And you could actually mount it read only, not change data, and start looking at the file system or the artifacts within that image. And that has been in the Mac almost forever. And some pretty old technology, which was basically the disk copy images in the day, were actually used. If you want to duplicate a floppy, you could use the old disk copy app and basically create a new floppy. But it had the capability of using larger images. And those were some of the very early techniques we used in that case way back then.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how Mac has a lot of stuff kind of built in, people don't even really understand. But yeah, it's kind of nice. So, you're definitely one of those very unique people who have the skills to be both a forensic examiner and a tool developer, right? Most people are either the developer or the examiner, but not both. But you clearly have the talent to be both. Do you have a preference for which side of the line you like better, or spend time on?
I've always sort of thought that that was my strength, right? From the standpoint that I was once an investigator, did actual cases, and I was a developer. And still to this day, I still do a lot of forensic cases. I assist law enforcement agencies all the time with cases. I even work with my local police department here in California. And part of it, being a developer, but also being an investigator, ties together so closely, because there's the possibility that if you kind of were at one point an investigator and then you potentially retire or you change roles or something like that, your information will start to get stagnant if you don't continue doing cases, right? Because obviously the technology is always changing. There's always new software, there's always new hardware, there's always new techniques. And if you're not actually doing the work of doing those investigations, I find that pretty quickly you'll kind of get bypassed by the technology or the new things coming out. And the software you develop at some point are going to have holes in it, right? Because you're not kind of putting that practical knowledge to work inside of software. And at BlackBag, a lot of things we used to talk about was when we develop software, we spend a lot of time developing great software, but a lot of what we would say would be, we're putting our expertise into that software, so you don't necessarily have to have all that expertise. Now, every investigator has to have, obviously a certain amount of expertise, but because there's so much going on, and I've specialized more on the Mac and iOS, but because there's so much going on, when we are in a role where we can kind of continue to do research and actually work on investigations and put that expertise into the tools, the investigator or the customer gets the benefit of that expertise in the tool. So I've always sort of thought that for me, I can't imagine myself being just a pure developer or being a pure investigator. I believe they go hand in hand. because you want those features to go into the software, because when you discover something, because you ran into something in an investigation where no tool will assist you with it, then you have the capability of potentially developing a tool
Hmm.
to actually solve that issue. And then, each time we figure out how to deal with a specific artifact or parse a certain file system, we would put that into our tools, and then that would be hopefully of huge benefit to the investigator and to the customer.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge advantage, for you because you are able to do all that. Actually, I'm
And
gonna.
if I can say one other thing too,
Mhm.
there's aspects of when you become an investigator and you get some basic training of how to deal with like a chain of evidence and how to deal with investigation techniques and things like that. There's stuff you learn as a law enforcement officer that is very difficult to learn if you're just a developer. And
Yeah,
I'm not saying just a developer to
right.
belittle, but
Hmm.
when you have that mindset of how you deal with an investigation, and sometimes I kind of refer to this a bit with investigators as a little bit of that sense of paranoia where where you kind of like, with your, based on your experience, it's like, oh, that guy's lying, oh, that guy is not telling the truth. And
Yeah.
I've always had interesting interactions with other people. It's like, how do you think that? How do you know that? And it's like, it's this sense I think you get when you've been in law enforcement and done investigations. Now,
Mhm.
I was not a street cop. I was basically, a law enforcement officer in a suit, but I still got a lot of that experience when I was doing investigations.
Right. So one thing that you mentioned is you also do a lot of training worldwide. Is there any particular countries that you really like being in, or any fun stories about going overseas training?
Uh, fun stories. Yeah, there were too many actually.
Well, we need them to be rated PG. We don't want to get kicked off
PG,
YouTube.
yeah, PG. Yeah, we'll keep the PG. It was funny. I was just talking about this with my daughter the other day. So I've done training, God, all over the place. I spent a lot of time in Europe. I spent some time in Asia, some time in Australia. I always loved going back to Canada and training at the Canadian Police College or other agencies in Canada. It was interesting. Growing up in Quebec and speaking French, I actually did training in France too, and I did the training all in French, right?
Wow.
And something I just did it a few years ago again in Paris. I was training there, and it's always funny because sort of French comes back, but there's certain terminology that just doesn't exist in French. Or you when you say something like a SCSI drive, how do you say that in French? Well, le SCSI drive, right, or something like that. But doing training all over the world has always been interesting, and I always thought it was funny too, doing training in the UK, or I do a lot of training with the Met, New Scotland Yard, and I had a certain way how I did my training, and I'd have my little jokes and stuff like that. And I remember one of the first times teaching New Scotland Yard people, and um, I was teaching the class and doing all my little jokes, and it was crickets. Everything fell flat, no laughs whatsoever. Meanwhile, Ben, my training partner, and some of the guys from the Met cannot stop laughing at the back of the class because I'm bombing so badly in this class that, and I'd say my joke and they wouldn't get it, and I had to completely retool my presentations and stuff and figure out how to do this differently. But they couldn't stop laughing at how badly I was performing as I was doing my training. And I spent some time in Australia doing training there. Very similar. It's like they wouldn't get my jokes at all. But I also spent a lot of time teaching in the Netherlands, which was always interesting too. I don't know if you've ever dealt with Dutch people, and there's a weird connection here. My mom is Dutch, right? She
Oh,
was
okay.
born in Holland.
Wow.
immigrated to Canada after the war. My last name is Donnelly. Pretty much everyone thinks of me as potentially Canadian or Irish, especially with a Donnelly as the last name. But more than anything, I'm actually Dutch. So I've been over to Netherlands quite a bit, and they kind of almost adopted me once they found out that my mom is actually Dutch, right?
Oh.
And I would do training in the Netherlands, and there was this one time that myself and one of my other training partners, we were in the Netherlands, and we were doing training there, and we had went out for supper, and we got back to the hotel, and we were getting ready to go back to our rooms, retire to our rooms for the evening. Bruce, who was with me, I think he was like on the second or third floor, and we're in the elevator, and he gets out of the elevator, and elevator kind of closes and kind of goes to the next floor, and then the elevator door won't open. And I ended up basically stuck in this elevator for about an hour and a half. I called the front desk, and person answered me in Dutch, and they couldn't actually hear me. I could hear them, they couldn't hear me. And I was basically stuck in this elevator for about an hour and a half. I'm sitting on my Pelican case with all my forensic equipment, just sitting there in the elevator, trying to text different people, trying to call, finally get a hold of Bruce. And he actually makes his way up to my floor. It was someone else. They kind of push open or get the door half open, and I put the Pelican case in the door, and I finally could get out the door, and we start hearing this yelling, and it was like, what's going on? Someone else was yelling at us, don't move the elevator, don't move the elevator, someone fell. And we ran downstairs to the lobby, and I guess someone else, two cooks from the restaurant, had pushed open the door, where I guess knew that I was stuck, but they pushed open the door, and one of the cooks fell down the elevator shaft.
Oh no.
And landed on the bottom of the elevator shaft, and got hurt pretty seriously. And I remember like going to the reception area and said, you guys have to call 911. We're going to need assistance. And then everyone in the world showed up. There was something like 6 police cars showed up, and paramedics and fire trucks, and a helicopter started circling. And they finally get this guy out of the elevator shaft and take him away in a life flight. And the next day we go back to our training class, and Bruce says, are you going to tell the story? And I tell the story, and it turns out I had made the national news in the Netherlands that it basically said American falls down elevator shaft. And I never fell down, right? And it was not, but we were involved in it. But there's this story that has circulated forever, and whenever I see someone from the Netherlands, they'll usually call me Lift Boy. They call elevators lifts, so they'll call me Lift Boy. And I've been at conferences where I've gotten into an elevator, and some of the guys from Holland, when they see me come into the elevator, they'll actually get out of the elevator. So
at least they didn't ban you from going into the country because you're going to screw up the elevators or something.
It's always been this joke, and each time I go for training there, they were saying, we're going to try to find a hotel that has no elevator for you or something like that. So anyways.
Stairs only.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Old school.
Boy. Oh yeah. So, since we're talking about training, a lot of our viewers here are new to digital forensics, or they want to get into the field of digital forensics. Do you have any tips and tricks for somebody who's just getting started or wants to get started in DFIR?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. As I mentioned before, again, I believe one of my greatest strengths was being a combination of an investigator and a developer. Now, I don't necessarily think everyone has to become a developer, but there are going to be situations where you're going to run into something and your tool is not going to deal with it. It's not going to parse it or something like that. And there are techniques that can potentially use using open source tools or using sometimes very simple Python scripts. And I always tell people, if you get an opportunity, try to learn some Python. Everyone always says this, and you don't necessarily have to be in computer science to learn Python, but there's a lot of college students now today will probably learn some Python, even though they may not be in computer science. So I tell people, it's like, if you get an opportunity, learn some Python. And if you're not actually coding, you may still get some skills from the standpoint of how to download a script, or potentially work with the dependencies, or install some of the other libraries are needed for the script, because there's tons of stuff out there. There's lots of resources for digital forensics, and not all the tools are going to do everything. And sometimes some of the most recent research may be some open source tool that might be Python based. There could be other languages, but if you have a little bit of experience with Python, you can often find tools to assist you to parse some obscure artifact, because someone else has done it, has written it in let's say Python or some other language. Now that can be a bit of an undertaking, to learn Python, but if you get a little experience with it, on the Windows side or Mac side, Linux side, whatever, it could be really, really helpful. And you get a bit of an understanding too of how a development and coding happens. As I said, you may not be writing the most complicated thing, but at least you have an understanding of the mechanics of how to potentially run these scripts. And as I said, there's tons of resources out there to assist you with this stuff. And there can be great capabilities that may not exist in your tool today that exists in some other script. The other thing that I do recommend, and this can be a little trickier, is like, if you can get that investigative background, that's going to really help you with your career too, because you're going to potentially learn how to also interact with, let's say, an investigator, because a lot of times digital forensics people might do the imaging, might do some basic parsing, may run some reports, and then hand that to the investigator, and then the investigator is potentially going to tie that to their case. They may not be as technical. You're more the technical person. But if you have an investigative background, you'll have a better understanding of what the investigator potentially needs, and you can interact better. And that's not always an easy thing. A lot of times you're going to get that investigative background by either, working with law enforcement or working as an investigator. But anything you can learn about sort of investigative techniques, and just sort of reading maybe things about related to interview techniques and stuff like that. If you're not an actual investigator, you still can learn from some of those techniques. So those are kind of two of the recommendations I always sort of give, from the standpoint that, if you're starting, those are two things that are interesting. And you hear this on listservs all the time. It's like, okay, I want to get in digital forensics. How do I start? Right. Well, a lot of times that can happen on the criminal side. It can happen on the civil side. But there are people that potentially learn how to do digital forensics and can run the software and stuff like that. But again, sometimes they don't have that mindset of how you deal with the chain of evidence, or how you interpret that evidence. And anything that can help you with investigative techniques, I think, is also very important.
Yeah, those are definitely two very, very good suggestions. So how about for somebody who is, not a entry level person, somebody who's been doing it for 2-3 years and they want to up their skills? Any suggestions for those folks?
There's a lot of training out there. It's sometimes really tricky to sort of figure out, what's the next greatest, biggest thing you want to sort of learn next. But and you're going to hear a little bit of my bias in this answer, from the standpoint, obviously I've been a big Mac guy for a long time. But one of the things that again was easier for me, especially on the Mac, was dropping down into a terminal and doing things in a Unix command line. So you might be familiar with some, great Windows tools. You might even, use things like PowerShell or some of the command line in Windows. But I think it's very, very, very worthwhile to upgrade your skills with understanding how to use Linux. Go get like an Ubuntu magazine or something like that and install Ubuntu on a system. Get familiar with how to install it, how you upgrade it, how you get things up to date on it, and then start doing things from the command line. Because again, some of these tools out there, some of these Python scripts, some of these Bash scripts and things like that, you may only get access to them by doing things in the terminal. A lot of people, they like the windows, they like the buttons and stuff like that, but a lot of times I do a lot of my investigations by doing things from the command line, because sometimes the app won't do what you need it to do, but sometimes there's a lot of functionality in the command line. And you'll notice as well as me, some of the aspects of sort of working with Linux, you can mount file systems that your OS may not mount. I saw someone on the listserv just the other day talking about ZFS. How do I deal with ZFS? Well, I don't think there's any tools out there right now that are even supporting ZFS. So that's where you potentially have to drop into maybe Linux on a system and kind of go the old-fashioned way of going in the terminal.
Being a Linux command line guy, you are totally validating what I've been preaching here for years and years and years. And I think people are going to think that I paid you to say all the things that you just said.
We didn't talk about this before, right?
There's no collusion. I know we've been friends for a long time, but there's no collusion here. This is all legit.
But I totally believe that. Like, again, and I've trained other people. And when I've done a lot of training, even when we were doing training on the Mac, way back when you do training for all these different agencies, especially on the Mac, when some of these this functionality we were talking about earlier about, some of the stuff built into the Mac, you can do that stuff from the command line. And then you can do stuff like use brew for Mac OS X to install other command line tools that are not part of Mac OS X, but have been compiled for Mac OS X, and brew can go and install them. And there's great functionality in the command line that can assist you with stuff that are just not going to be part of some of those GUI tools.
Yeah. So speaking of technology, changes and challenges and whatnot, what latest technology changes has been keeping you up at night?
Good question. Really good question. I thought we've been hearing a lot about different apps out there. I believe like Snapchat is one of them that basically have their own browser built in. And this really concerns me from the standpoint that, you might be using an iOS device or an Android device and using that app. And there's times that you may be thinking you're browsing and you might be using Safari or, a browser that's built into the OS, and you're not actually using that browser. You're actually using a browser that is built into the app. And just recently at DEF CON Black Hat, there was some research that was showing that some of these apps have their own browser built in that they can, by the way, record the different things you're typing in, record the places you're going, and have access to basically a lot more information than you just, browsing with the app and potentially texting someone, because they're kind of fooling you into thinking that you're using a browser, but you're actually using this custom browser that's built into the app. And to me, that's really interesting for forensics too, because later on, when you're potentially going to try to show that someone was using an app and may have been communicating with someone, it may not be leaving behind the artifacts you think might be there. And some of these apps have been built to specifically avoid leaving artifacts behind, and they're making it more and more difficult to potentially prove that the app may have been used. And Snapchat is one of those apps where it typically doesn't leave a lot behind, and it's kind of been a big headache for law enforcement. But it concerns me a lot too, from the standpoint it's used by with myself having some kids in high school right now and university, it's used a lot by young people, and a lot of similar apps. And there's a lot of sharing going on between accounts. In some cases, there's sharing passwords and things like that. And it can be really difficult to do those type of investigations because you don't know who's actually creating the content, if it's actually leaving the artifacts behind. And they are apps that have basically been built to be covert. From a standpoint, it's not leaving much trace behind. Now, we know there's a lot of talk today about privacy, and I respect the apps that are potentially helping you try to keep things private, but they could be a really big headache for some of these investigations. So that's one of the things that kind of keeps me awake. And two other things I tend to think about a little bit too. The other part that's always fascinating to me is vehicle forensics, which is this hot area too in forensics, where you start to extract artifacts and things from vehicles, which I think is always fascinating, because you have a tendency to you buy a new car and you're kind of looking for, does it have CarPlay, does it have these different technologies to basically sync up your phone. But cars are still, when it comes to some of these infotainment systems and like doing CarPlay and things like that, there's still a little bit of the Wild West from the standpoint. Your phones are getting really secure. In some cases, the phones, like iOS, is a bit more of a black box, because there's a lot of proprietary stuff going on there compared to Android, which is more open source. But then you're syncing it up with a vehicle that may be sharing information. And there's this whole other aspect of mobile forensics involving vehicles, which is kind of true mobile forensics of this car driving around and having linked up your information. And then there's this whole aspect of people texting while they're driving, and or using all these different apps while they're potentially driving, which obviously brings up safety concerns. But this aspect of sort of sharing with your vehicle all this information is very interesting. I've been involved with it, been looking a little bit at vehicle forensics, and taking some training and stuff like that. I'm always amazed at how people will rent a car and immediately sync up their phone. And almost every time I've rented a car, I've seen the previous user's data sitting in that car. And that worries me from the standpoint that we have a bit of a habit of downloading a lot of apps and syncing things to our phone, and we don't necessarily know where that data is going, especially you've rented a car and then you drop it off, and then you literally see the last 10 phones that were actually synced to the car, and who potentially the contacts left behind, which just amazes me. And this is something else that, like, car rental companies have to sort of figure out how they're going to wipe that information when it goes to the next user. And they're doing a good job of potentially cleaning the outside of the car, but not necessarily cleaning the inside of the car, the data aspect of it, right?
Yeah, that's actually, to some aspects more important, right? Cleaning the inside or the contents of the infotainment center. Because yeah, like you said, I've gone and rented cars and I've been able to flip around and look at people's contacts. Like, oh my God, this is privacy issues.
I know.
And I know some manufacturers do have, in the settings, you can clear those things. So I think, basically the car companies or the rental car companies just need to put that as part of their checklist. Oh, I fueled it up. I, make sure all the tires are filled, and I, clear the memory from the infotainment. They just got to make that part of their process.
I was amazed the last rental I did, when I signed the agreement at the bottom, it actually said something about the aspect of be aware your data may be left on the vehicle, and that you are
Oh,
acknowledging that your data may be left on the vehicle.
wow.
And it was actually in the agreement. And the first time I saw it, it's like I actually took a picture of this, because they're not necessarily saying we're going to take care of it. They're saying we're not responsible if you leave the data
Right.
behind. Yeah.
Wow, I'm amazed not just by the fact that they have that in their agreement. I'm amazed that you actually read the fine print. Who does that?
And I almost never do. I almost never do. But it was funny because it was the last clause just above the signature line. And that's why it caught my attention. It's like, wow, this is interesting. There's one other thing I want to bring up too, that I thought that, you said the things that potentially keep me up at night. It's amazing how we're thinking more and more about, putting all this stuff in the cloud. And it's amazing how we're also doing investigations, and we're putting our investigation information in the cloud from the standpoint, like review tools and stuff like that. I saw some recent advertisements basically saying, don't send your evidence on a USB drive. Use our tool, right? And that's great. There's great functionality there. I find that really interesting. But when I think of some of the largest companies in the world are having data breaches left and right, and I have a hard time securing your password and your credentials, I worry a lot about now these solutions are you're potentially putting evidence in the cloud that at some point could potentially be compromised, and you could potentially end up, really screwing up your case because data got public. Let's say that one really keeps me awake. Now I know why it's so important to do it. Time access to these resources is great, and again, shipping a drive to the other side of the country is always difficult. And you and I have dealt with this in the past. We've sent things, potentially encrypted by, Box or different tools like this. But it's always encrypted, right? It's all, we always take the time to make sure it's encrypted. But when solutions like this are set up in the cloud, I always worry that some of the biggest companies in the world are having data breaches, and they have a lot of people dealing with that security, and some of these other solutions may not have so many eyes on it. And when potentially those data breaches happen with evidence, I'm concerned what happens in the long run.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't thought about that, but I have seen a lot of advertisement, for the police agencies, right? Oh, here's where you can store your body cam data
Right.
on the cloud and whatnot. And that, yeah, that could be potentially hacked, and that stuff is just all out there. So yeah, that's a good one. So there's definitely a lot of changes, in technology. How do you keep up with everything?
I've taken some steps like using Google, and then how you can sort of define these are some of the subjects I'm interested in, then you get some of those feeds specifically. And I've over time have put in specific things of interest, let's say in the digital forensics arena, and then I get those notifications. So I like to, even when I look at things as simple as, let's say, LinkedIn and Twitter and things like that, I do try to limit my areas of interest, especially in digital forensics, to basically get notifications of those things. I do spend probably every morning, probably 30 minutes, doing some updates and reading some of the latest listserv stuff that I'll look at. And I usually am decently okay from the standpoint I have a bit of an idea of what are the latest trends and things like that. I had to do in the last couple of years, I had to do a lot of research on cryptocurrency. And that was another one that was, you couldn't turn on your computer without hearing something about cryptocurrency. And it's been very interesting how, sort of its meteoric rise, and now how things now have been sort of falling right now from the standpoint of value and things like that. And it was kind of like the really, really hot thing, 2 years ago, and NFTs and all this stuff. And I'm not getting into the really deep stuff unless I'm, specifically doing research on it. But I do find that between the different sort of listservs and some podcasts and a couple of different solutions that I try to keep up to date with, it does require probably about 30 minutes a day where I'm trying to read some of the latest stuff and stay on top of it. A lot of it too, I'm just kind of deleting stuff. Yeah, that's not of interest to me, not of interest to me. But then there's always some things that I'm following. I have a very long sort of like reading list of stuff that I still want to get to. Here at my desk here, just to my right, there's I've got 6 programming books are just sitting there for my next sort of bit of reading. And my wife does get annoyed at me because I tend to at night watch TV with my laptop, literally, sitting in my lap as I'm watching something on TV and, reading something on the laptop, or, doing some development. I'm constantly doing some coding and testing stuff. And from the standpoint of being a developer, and I often hear people saying, is there something that can parse this? And a lot of times when no answers come up, then I usually will create a sample for myself and see how I can parse it. And to me, it's strange to say, but I find it relaxing to actually do some coding. A lot of people don't do that, and I joke about that. I code at night in my sleep. I often think about a problem, and during the night I will dream about it. And this sounds goofy, but I swear to God, there's many times I've actually dreamt about the code. In the morning I wake up, and before anything, I actually grab a laptop and start coding a few things because for some reason I was thinking about it during the night.
Oh boy, this actually brings us into this next section I want to do. I'm going to call it Fun with Derrick. And basically what I'm going to do is ask you a few questions, and I want you to answer with either a one-word answer or just a very short phrase. Okay, whatever the first thing that comes to your mind.
Okay, interesting.
All right, so the first question is, what was the last book you read?
It was a book on Go, Golang, which is a programming language. That's actually what I'm reading right now.
Okay, all right. Second question is, what is a must-have carry-on item for you when you go abroad?
I have a small 3-port USB duplicator. So you can put one USB in a slot, and you have 2 other slots where you can actually basically duplicate to the other 2 slots. It's about this big, and I pretty much carry it with me everywhere I go now. So.
Oh, very cool. I'm going to have to ask you for that after the interview here.
I think it was like $155 on Amazon or something like that. Okay. Well worth it. Yeah.
All right. All right. Third question. What was your last celebrity sighting?
Oh, now this is kind of interesting. So I was on vacation in the UK this summer. I was there for 3 weeks, and I was in London for about 5 days. I walked down the street from my hotel, and down the street there was a pub, and I was sitting at a table, and at a table right beside me, the actor Bill Nye was
Oh,
right beside me,
wow.
and he was talking to someone else. And it was funny because I walked by and I kind of looked over, and it's like, wow, looks like that actor. Right? And I didn't think so much of it. I sat down at this table and I was drinking a Guinness. And then some other people walked by and stopped and actually took a picture with him and said, "Oh yeah, that is Bill Nye." And Bill Nye was in a bunch of movies like Underworld
Yep.
and Love Actually,
Hmm,
and
hmm.
he's kind of a quite famous actor in the UK. He's also been in Pirates of the Caribbean and stuff like that. So at one point I said, I I have to do it. So as he was walking away, I went up to him and said, "Hey, I just want to say hi, and I really enjoy your acting." He was very, very, very nice. He actually took a picture with me, and that just happened like 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago.
Wow. Wow. Very timely. Cool. Very cool. All right. Next question is, if you could go anywhere in the world right now, where would that be?
I keep on seeing these travel blog or travel advertisements, and I want to go to Tahiti, and I
Mm.
want to be on one of those little huts that is above the water
Oh, yeah.
with like the little balcony that you can sort of hang out, like so it's like the whole hut is just above the water, right? And I would love to be able to, like, from that balcony just jump into the water and walk back up. I am trying to figure out how to get myself to Tahiti. Figure out how to do forensics on a Tahiti hut in the water, right?
Okay. All right. Just got to get the power cord.
Right, right.
All right. Next one. What is your favorite coding snack? Your snack that you have while you're doing coding?
It's either Jelly Bellies or gummy bears.
All right.
And I
Two
eat
good
a
ones.
lot of I eat a lot of them.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. So I think I've taken up enough of your time. We can do this again at another time. But I want to just give you a chance to wrap things up. If there's anything else you'd like to add that we have not talked about.
No, I appreciate the time. I appreciate talking to you. I always love talking about digital forensics. It's been one of my passions for a very, very long time. I've been incredibly fortunate. Like, I kind of ended up in this totally by accident, and when I ended up in law enforcement, and when I came to California and started working for Apple, it was a tricky thing for me because I had to give up my badge and then go work on the private side, go work for
Mhm.
Apple and then starting BlackBag. But my heart, has always been with law enforcement, and it's one of those things that I find I've been very fortunate to do something that I love doing, but it's also quite lucky that I can assist law enforcement with, sometimes really difficult cases, horrible things that they have to deal with, and potentially, are trying to potentially bring a case to justice, and, do the right, it sounds corny, put bad guys in jail, but there are obviously situations that happen in these criminal investigations where I've been very fortunate that because of some of my skills and being able to program and being able to assist them with these cases in a timely manner, because sometimes they don't have much time. I've been able to code something and help them with a case, and it's been the key to the case. So to me, it's one of those important things that I still want to heavily be involved in with law enforcement and give back to law enforcement when I can and assist whenever I can with investigations. So I appreciate the time, and it's if it gives an idea of other people doing digital forensics, that's amazing, because we need more people. We need more technical people doing this, and it's just going to get more complicated with all these new devices.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Derrick. I really appreciate you spending time with us.
No problem at all.
If you are interested in getting started in Windows forensics, watch these videos here. If you are interested in getting started in learning about the Linux command line, watch these videos here. Thanks for your time and see you again.